Hey guys, welcome back to the sixth class of NAIL IB's Economics HL and SL for the International Baccalaureate Diploma Program. This is the sixth video of Chapter 1 and I am, again, super psyched to start off. Today, we'll be discussing a super duper important concept known as opportunity cost. So in the previous class, we learned that we need to make choices, right? Because, well, we can't have everything because of limited resources, because of scarcity. And this scarcity leads us to make the three basic economic choices, us in the economy. The economy needs to answer the three basic economic questions of what to produce, how to produce, and for whom to produce for. Now, think about when you make a decision, okay? Suppose you have enough money to go on a holiday, okay? You have $500. You perhaps want to go to Florida, or you want to go to New York, right? $500 to finance your entire trip, okay? But you can't do both. So you decide that you're more of a sand and surf type of person. And so you go to Florida, right? That is essentially your decision, okay? But as we know, everything has a cost, right? And the cost of your decision to go to Florida is the trip to New York, okay? Now, what is this cost? It is the opportunity cost, okay? It is the cost measured in terms of the alternative which you have given up. When you chose to go to Florida, right, you gave up going to New York. Going to New York is the opportunity cost of going to Florida. Another example would be, suppose you go to a mall one day, one weekend, and you only have enough money to buy one lunch, okay? You only have enough money to have at one restaurant. There are two restaurants in the whole mall, which is a Subway and a McDonald's, fast food. But you don't have enough money to eat at both, okay? And you decide that you want to eat a little bit more healthy, so you go to Subway. And so, essentially, you've made the decision to eat at Subway, and you've sacrificed eating at McDonald's. So, the opportunity cost of eating at Subway is the sacrificed eating at McDonald's, okay? It is the cost measured in terms of the alternative which you give up when you make a decision. Think of any decision which you make, anyone. All of those decisions have an opportunity cost, something which you didn't do because you made your decision. You wanted to go to the movies. The opportunity cost of that decision, the opportunity cost of going to the movies, is the study time you could have put in, or the time you could have put in to do your chores or play sports. Essentially, it's anything which you give up when you make a decision, okay? The easier way to understand is the opportunity cost of any decision is the alternate decision or decisions which you sacrificed when you did make a decision, okay? So that is opportunity cost. And that ties into the entire economic model of choice and scarcity, right? What we sacrifice when we make a choice. We move on to another very, very important concept known as the production possibilities model. Economics relies a lot on modeling, not the New York or Paris Fashion Week models, all right? Graphical models, representations of information on a graph, right? Now, what is a production possibilities model? The definition is it's a graphical representation of the maximum possible combinations of goods and services that an economy can produce with its given resources at a particular point in time. It is essentially the total output that an economy can produce given its resources, okay? So what does a PPC, a production possibilities curve or frontier, you can call it either ways, it really doesn't matter. For this video, I'll be referring to it as PPC. A production possibilities curve effectively demonstrates opportunity cost, the concepts of scarcity and choice, as well as inefficiency. We'll see how. Opportunity cost, because Essentially, the economy needs to decide which which quantity of output to produce, which combination of output to produce. Okay, so it needs to make a choice because there's scarcity. And as we learned, any choice has an opportunity cost. All right, so a production possibilities curve displays from the get-go, from the very beginning, three concepts of opportunity cost, scarcity, and choice. And now we'll see what a PPC actually looks like. Okay, and also make a mental note of this. Any point on a production possibilities curve is known as a production possibility. It's pretty simple, right? So just remember. Moving on, there are certain assumptions we need to adhere to before we move on to what the graph looks like. Okay, the first of that assumption is that all resources are being utilized efficiently. That means that there is no wastage. In economic terminology, there is allocative efficiency. Now, what is allocative efficiency? Think to the previous video. Allocative efficiency is when resources are optimally employed with minimum wastage so as to take into account consumer preference. Okay, that means there's no inefficiency, there's no wastage. That's the first assumption. The second assumption is that all resources are fully employed. All right, as I said, minimal wastage, and there's allocative efficiency as well as productive efficiency. Productive efficiency over here means that everything is being produced, all the output is being produced at the minimal possible cost. If you're producing at a higher cost, it means that there is an efficiency, and that cannot be accepted, not in this hypothesis. Okay, a PPC assumes that there is efficiency, both allocative and productive. Productive efficiency means goods are being produced at the lowest possible cost, and allocative efficiency means that resources are being optimally employed in the production process themselves. Okay, the third assumption is that there are only two goods and services produced. I know no economy in the world produces only two goods or services. Okay, they always produce multiple, but this is a simple representation of a very complex economic situation. So this one assumes that there are only two goods and services being produced by an economy. Okay, we'll see how it's represented. And the final assumption is that there is no trade. There is no international trade going on with other economies. The economy is self-sufficient in that it produces whatever its citizens need by itself. Okay, no one trades with it. So these are the four assumptions that go into making a production possibilities curve. All right, and so we move on to seeing what a PPC looks like. Now, if you could direct your attention to the table over here, we see, if you can follow my cursor, we see that there are 5 points, A, B, C, D, and there are two goods or services being produced. All right, goods over here, cars and shirts. Okay, now, as I said before, every point over here represents a combination of possible goods and services that can be produced by an economy. Okay, so we see when 50 cars are produced, no shirts are produced. Why? It's because all resources have been diverted to the production of cars. There can be no resources diverted to shirts. Thus, 0 shirts are produced and the maximum number of cars are produced. Okay, this is one possible combination, point A. Another possible combination is 30 cars and 20 shirts. Now, because you're producing less than the maximum amount of cars, it obviously means you have resources which you can divert to some other cause, right? Some other production process. That is essentially the production process of making shirts. So when you produce 30 cars, you can produce 20 shirts. Okay? And guys, again, this is a hypothetical situation. Okay? Then we move on to C, where 25 cars are being produced. Okay? And now 35 cars and now 35 shirts are being produced. We see 25 cars and 35 shirts being produced. The number of shirts being produced now is more, indicating that more resources have been diverted to shirt production Then car production. Car is now 25 compared to shirts being produced 35. And then we see a fall of cars being produced to 10, and now 38 shirts are being produced by the economy. All right, this is point D. And finally, we see point E, which is the complete opposite of point A. All right, we see 0 cars are being produced and 43 shirts are being produced. All resources have been allocated to the production of shirts, and the maximum number of shirts that can be produced is 43. This is essentially the starting point, the data you need to create a production possibilities curve. Now, I want you to direct your attention to the graph on the left-hand side of the screen, okay? Follow with me. We see on the y-axis the number of cars, okay? 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. And then on the x-axis, which is the horizontal axis, all right, we see the number of shirts, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, okay? Now, when we start plotting the points, something interesting comes up, all right? So we see that the number of cars being produced is maximum at 50 and 0 shirts are being produced. So this is point A, okay? Then we move to point B, okay? Point B is where 30 cars and 20 shirts are being produced, right? Then we move on to point C. Here we see that 25 cars are being produced and 35 shirts are being produced, right here, okay? And then we see that 10 cars are being produced, 10, and around 38 shirts are being produced over here. And finally, we see at point E that 0 cars are being produced and 43 shirts are being produced, in that the maximum number of shirts are being produced. And thus we see a formation of the curve. And that, my friends, is the production possibility curve. So it's essentially mapping the different possible combinations of goods or services that an economy can produce with the given amount of resources it has in a particular point of time. All right? Now, what are these 2 points? Point F and point G. You notice how all the production possibility points A through E, are on the curve. That is because all resources are being used efficiently. That is the first assumption. There needs to be productive and allocative efficiency. Okay? So whenever there is both productive and allocative efficiency in general, all right, the points of production will always be on the curve. When we go to point F, it is a point where around 25 cars and 20 shirts are being produced. That is an inefficient production point. All right. This is a point where the production processes are not efficient. There is no allocative efficiency, means that resources are not being optimally employed. And there is neither any productive efficiency, means that products, all right, the goods and services being produced are not being produced at the lowest possible cost. The cost is higher than the lowest possible cost. So we see that this is an inefficient production point. All right. So you never, if an economy, all right, is producing inside the curve, it will be inefficient. It is producing in an inefficient manner. Fun fact, in the real world, attaining productive absolute efficiency, both productive and allocative, is impossible. Okay, there are too many variables at play. So an economy in the real world will always produce inside the curve. Why? Because of inefficiencies, right? Now, similar to this, all right, there's G. Now, G is the complete opposite of F, but the concepts are the same. G cannot be attained, all right? It is an unattainable production point because the economy does not have enough resources to produce at this point. Over here, we see that 45 cars, all right, if we look at the y-axis, 45 cars are being produced and around 40 shirts are being produced. Okay? That cannot be done because this production possibility point G cannot be produced at because there are insufficient resources. There aren't enough factors of production to produce at this point. Thus, we call it an unattainable point. However, if a curve experiences an outward shift because it perhaps gains more resources, all right, then G will become attainable, because as the curve moves outwards, we see that the curve touches G and G is suddenly attainable. So moving on, all right, we see that G is unattainable, F is inefficient, and points A through E are the efficient production possibilities. Now, the table over here represents the possible production combinations of cars and shirts in an economy, as I've said before. Okay, I've also stated that F is an inefficient productive point. Now, there is inefficiency and underutilization of resources, and point G is a point which cannot be produced at by the economy because there aren't enough resources. Right? We see that an economy needs to decide which point to produce at. Economy needs to decide if they want to produce at point A, point B, point C, point D, or point E. Okay? So that's essentially the choice factor that comes into play. Why? Because there's scarcity of resources, and the choice they make leads to an opportunity cost. The opportunity cost of producing at point A, 50 cars and 0 shirts, is producing at points B, C, D, and E. It is essentially the alternatives which are foregone. Moving on, what did we just learn? Okay, we learned that an economy, if it produces in an efficient manner, it will always produce on the production possibility curve. It will not produce inside the curve. If it does, all right, and that's a very big if. Okay, it needs to be efficient both in an allocative and productive manner to produce on the curve. And we also learned that if there is any inefficiency, it will produce inside the curve. Thus, we understand that there is a relationship between efficiency and curve production. If there is more efficiency, it will produce closer to the curve or on the curve. And if there is more inefficiency, it will produce inside the curve. Okay? And lastly, we learned that the curve will expand. You see these arrows over here? They will produce at higher levels. This curve will move and cover a wider area when the curve will expand only when the economy discovers new resources, or perhaps it produces those goods and services with greater efficiency due to technological innovation, and thus it can produce more and more efficiently. So either it gets more resources or it becomes more efficient for the curve to move outwards. Those are the two conditions where the curve can move out. All right. Furthermore, we see that because of scarcity, the economy cannot produce outside the curve. Why? There simply aren't enough resources, right? The quantity and quality of resources are fixed for the economy. It cannot simply just buy more at a given point of time. It only has a certain amount. Remember the assumption that there is no trade. Okay, it has a limited amount of resources. So since everything can't be produced, they need to make a choice at which point they want to operate, at which point they want to produce. So essentially, making a choice has an opportunity cost associated with it. So we see that the concepts of efficiency, opportunity cost, choice, and scarcity are all embodied simultaneously by a production possibility curve. Now, this is also another important part, all right? We see that there are two distinct types of production possibilities curve, okay? We see that there's a curve, one, like the one we saw with cars and shirts. And there's also another type of curve with two different goods, okay, basketballs and baseballs. Now, why is there such a difference in the type of curve? Why is one linear? Why is the one on the right linear? And why is the other one curvilinear? So in the one with the curve, the PPC has an increasing opportunity cost, all right? Essentially, the cost of producing cars increases with every new production possibility point. But over here, if we see producing basketballs on the y-axis and producing baseballs on the x-axis, we see that it is linear. No matter how many points, the cost is the same. And we still see that there's inefficient production and there is unattainable resource section over here. Now, why is there this difference of opportunity cost? Why does one have more and another one is constant? Remember this, it's because of the type of factors of production and economy has. Okay, opportunity cost changes because of the type of product being produced as well as the production process being employed. And when we talk about producing cars and shirts, obviously the machinery needed to make cars is very different from the machinery that is used to make shirts. The factors of production aren't really suited to produce both. Okay, so we see that the economy has a larger opportunity cost if it wants to produce either. Okay, it increases if you move from cars to shirts, and it increases when you move from shirts to cars. Why? Because the products are different, the resources needed to make those products are different, as well as the production processes. Cars is more, perhaps, mechanic. It's more capital intensive. It uses more machinery, whereas shirts is more labor intensive. There's more stitching involved and it uses different resources. However, when there are two similar products being produced, such as basketballs and baseballs, both of them are a type of ball, right? So the machinery needed to produce will be similar. The materials they use will be similar. Thus, opportunity cost will be nearly constant when you produce either of these. So that's essentially why there are two types of PPCs. It's because the type of product and the production process has an impact. So moving on, we see that this model assumes that rational economic decision making. All right, it is very important to know this. And not only this model, everything in economics, all right, especially monetarist economics, all right, assumes rational economic decision making. Okay, economic agents, right, such as firms, households, governments, and individuals, all right, they act in a manner which benefits them, which increases their utility. So we say when individuals or economic agents are acting with rational economic decision making, they're acting in a manner which benefits themselves. Okay, this is the first assumption that economics as a whole makes. Okay, another very integral assumption is the ceteris paribus assumption. Ceteris paribus is a Latin phrase meaning every other thing stays the same for the duration for this entire course. All right, when we are creating something, when we are creating a model, we will assume that there are only two variables which will be changing. There are only some variables which will be changing while everything else stays the same. And that is essentially the foundation of economics, where we can only focus on certain factors without discussing the others. So we need to take into account only a few factors while we assume everything else stays the same. Why? Because if we were to take into account everything else, like perhaps what's going on outside the economy, what's going on in the minds of people, it would become impossible to make decisions or deduce outcomes in economics. So that is why we assume that every other thing stays the same. That ceteris paribus applies when we're making a model or when we're writing an answer. And that's essentially it for this class. Guys, go over these concepts again because these are foundational and very important for your understanding of the next class. So guys, revise these topics, do a little additional reading on it, and I will see you next class, all right? Until then, stay safe, stay cool.